January 1942. Somewhere beyond the Arctic Circle, the night never ends. The wind slices through the air like razors, carrying snow so fine it burns the skin. A convoy soldier grips his rifle, but his fingers barely respond. The metal is colder than death itself. Around him, men move in slow, trembling silence, each breath crystallizing in front of their faces before vanishing into the white void. Frost clings to everything, uniforms, weapons, even their eyelashes. The temperature drops to -80 Fahrenheit. At that point, oil thickens, steel cracks, and skin turns black within seconds. The cold is not just weather, it's an enemy, one that kills without firing a shot. But then one soldier lowers his hands into view. His gloves are stitched differently, rough seams running like scars across the leather. While others' hands bleed, his still move. He loads his weapon, his grip steady. Those gloves were made by a small-town craftsman no one had ever heard of. A glove maker whose strange triple-stitch method would soon save thousands of lives, turning an ordinary piece of clothing into a weapon of survival. And it all began with a single experiment. In warmth. When most people think of World War II, they imagine the fire and thunder of tanks, artillery, and dogfights in the skies. But in the northernmost reaches of the war, beyond Murmansk, through Norway's frozen fjords and across the endless Arctic seas, the deadliest enemy was invisible. It was cold, the kind of cold that turned breath into shards of ice and froze exposed flesh in seconds. By the winter of 1941, the German advance toward the Soviet Union had brought entire armies into climates no soldier was prepared for. Hitler's forces, stretched thin and ill-equipped for deep winter warfare, faced temperatures that plummeted below -60. The Soviets, hardened by generations of cold, endured, but barely. Thousands froze to death before even firing a shot. In the far north, another silent front emerged, the Arctic convoys. Allied ships carried weapons, vehicles, and supplies from Britain and America to the Soviet ports of Arkhangelsk and Murmansk. Every voyage was a perilous journey through blizzards, ice floes, and skies filled with German bombers. It wasn't just the U-boats that haunted these men, it was the cold itself. Deck crews reported boots frozen to the metal decks, gun barrels frosted over, food became stone, fingers snapped when gloves tore. Frostbite, not bullets, crippled more soldiers than enemy fire. In January 1942 alone, Soviet records show over 90,000 frostbite cases near the Leningrad and Murmansk fronts. Many lost fingers, toes, or entire limbs. Even seasoned Arctic sailors described the pain as beyond endurance. It was warfare against an element no one could see, only feel. The British War Office received desperate cables from northern units. Gloves disintegrate after one day's use. Men unable to load weapons, hands frozen stiff. In these frozen corners of the war, technology failed. Standard-issue gloves, usually wool or thin leather, absorbed moisture, froze solid, and tore under stress. The U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps soon realized that this wasn't a minor issue. It was a logistical crisis. An army that could not hold its rifles, steer its trucks, or repair its machinery was an army already defeated. Scientists from Massachusetts to Manchester were summoned to find a solution. The challenge? Create a glove that could endure sub-zero combat conditions, resist moisture, maintain flexibility, and, most importantly, protect human skin from freezing metal. But most industrial glove makers of the time were focused on production speed, not endurance. Their designs used straight seams that weakened under pressure, single layers that trapped sweat, and stitching that failed when wet. The military needed something new, something radical. It was during this frantic search that attention turned to small-scale craftsmen. Local glove makers, cobblers, and textile innovators across North America and Europe were quietly invited to submit designs. Among them was a man from upstate New York, a humble leather craftsman whose gloves had earned a small reputation among Arctic trappers for their uncanny durability. His method was unorthodox. He stitched each layer 3 times, using alternating thread angles that distributed stress evenly. It looked strange, even crude, but the gloves never split. When military engineers examined one of his samples, they noticed something remarkable. Unlike factory-made gloves that tore at the seams, his stitching actually tightened when exposed to cold. The threads contracted microscopically, sealing the seams tighter as the temperature fell. It was an accident of design, but it worked. The discovery came just as reports from the Arctic front worsened. Crews on HMS Trinidad and USS Washington were losing hands to frostbite at alarming rates. Mechanics couldn't refuel planes because hoses froze solid in their grasp. The triple-stitched glove, made by a craftsman who had never seen war, suddenly became a candidate for mass production. Still, the idea faced skepticism. Military procurement officers dismissed it as unscalable and unscientific. Yet a few field officers, desperate for any solution, ordered small test batches. The results would soon astonish everyone. The war's coldest battles were about to be fought with something simple but born of genius and survival instinct. And as the freezing storms thickened over Murmansk, a quiet experiment began in an American workshop, one that would change Arctic warfare forever. In the winter of 1942, as Arctic warfare intensified, the Allies realized that technology alone couldn't conquer nature. Tanks froze solid in the tundra, aircraft engines cracked, and even ink turned to ice. The fight for warmth became as critical as the fight for ammunition. It was in this desperate climate that military scientists turned to an unlikely hero. Craftsmanship born not from laboratories, but from the rhythm of hand and thread. The small workshop in upstate New York belonged to a man named Samuel Worthington, a second-generation glove maker from Gloversville, a town once known as the leather capital of America. For decades, his family had produced winter gloves for hunters and lumbermen. Worthington's father had taught him a simple rule: a glove fails at the stitch, not the skin. During the Depression, when factories cut costs and switched to cheaper seams, Worthington refused. He stitched by hand using 3 staggered passes of waxed linen thread, sealing the leather from inside out. It took 4 times longer, but his gloves lasted 4 winters instead of 1. In early 1942, the U.S. Army Quartermaster Testing Service sent representatives to dozens of small workshops like Worthington's, collecting samples for extreme cold trials. Worthington's design, marked Model W3, stood out instantly. It wasn't elegant. It looked rough, with raised seams like ridges across the fingers. But when soaked, frozen, and flexed in testing chambers, it refused to tear. The linen thread swelled just enough to lock moisture out, while the triple seam distributed pressure away from stress points. Even when dropped into dry ice and hammered, the seams didn't split. Word spread through testing centers at Natick and Edgewood. The W3 doesn't fail, one report stated flatly, even under continuous flex at 70 degrees. For soldiers accustomed to gloves that turned to stiff boards, this was nothing short of miraculous. At the same time, across the Atlantic, British and Canadian units stationed in northern Norway and Finland faced identical challenges. Their mittens, made from standard-issue wool, became deadly when wet. In a chilling 1941 report from the British 5th Infantry Brigade, one soldier wrote, "Our hands bleed inside the gloves. When the fabric freezes, it tears the skin like sandpaper." Engineers from the Royal Army, Clothing Department began to experiment with layered glove systems, an inner wool liner for insulation, and an outer shell of waterproof leather. When they heard about the American triple-stitch design, they requested samples through the Allied Materials Exchange Program. Within months, prototypes reached the British Arctic forces. Soldiers immediately noticed the difference. The gloves were stiffer at first, but once worn, they molded to the hand like armor. The seams held even when soaked in seawater and refrozen. In the Soviet Union, similar innovations were emerging. Local factories in Arkhangelsk began producing 3-layer gloves combining reindeer hide, wool, and canvas. But it was the Western design, particularly Worthington's method, that offered a scalable solution. By late 1942, U.S. and British manufacturing plants began replicating the triple-stitch system using machinery adapted from shoe production lines. The design became standardized under the code Glove Arctic Pattern 43. Its introduction coincided with one of the coldest winters in modern history. During the Murmansk convoy PQ-18 in September 1942, temperatures on deck dropped to -80 Fahrenheit with wind chill. Crews wearing the new gloves reported 0 frostbite cases on exposed duty shifts lasting over an hour, an unprecedented record. Commanders wrote to the War Office praising the design, calling it the difference between life and death on Arctic stations. What made Worthington's method revolutionary was not only its durability, but its principle. Each seam locked 3 layers together: inner wool, outer leather, and a moisture barrier in between, without puncturing all layers in a straight line. This prevented wind and water from entering while allowing trapped heat to circulate. It was simple engineering, born from intuition, not calculation. By 1943, production ramped up dramatically. The U.S. Army commissioned several factories in New York, Pennsylvania, and Ontario to produce the Arctic Pattern 43 gloves at scale. Yet few soldiers ever knew the name behind them. Worthington's contribution remained buried in technical memos, overshadowed by tanks, planes, and generals. But his creation quietly reshaped the Arctic War. As the polar night deepened and soldiers faced the coldest hours of their lives, a pair of gloves stitched by one man's stubborn belief in craftsmanship gave them the strength to fight, repair, and survive. And soon, that human angle, the story of warmth in a frozen war, would reveal just how much a simple stitch could mean to survival itself. War often reduces survival to weapons, rations, and willpower, but in the Arctic campaigns of World War II, something far more elemental decided life or death: warmth. Soldiers didn't just fight the enemy, they fought their own bodies. When hands froze, rifles jammed, and fingers turned black, a man's will meant little. The glove became a tool of combat as vital as the rifle itself. In every cold front photograph, you can see it, the subtle agony behind the stoic faces. Men huddled around stoves, rubbing their hands, desperate for blood to flow again. A soldier could fire a gun, write a report, or fix an engine, only if his fingers obeyed him. The loss of dexterity from frostbite was catastrophic. Entire squads became useless, not because they were shot, but because they couldn't move their hands. By early 1942, the U.S. Army Medical Corps classified cold injuries as a major combat disability, second only to wounds inflicted by weapons. Reports from the Eastern Front confirmed the same for German forces. In one chilling entry, a Wehrmacht doctor wrote, "We are losing hands faster than bullets. That was the human cost, the quiet suffering of men turning into statues beneath frozen skies." Now imagine one of those soldiers, the nameless Arctic convoy gunner, gripping his anti-aircraft mount as sleet whips across his face. His hands, encased in Worthington's triple-stitched gloves, remain flexible. He adjusts the sights, reloads, fires, lives. Next to him, another man's standard-issue glove stiffens. He struggles, misses his mark, and succumbs to frostbite before dawn. That difference, one glove design, becomes a deciding factor between function and failure. But beyond survival, there was a tactical dimension. Cold weather crippled logistics. Mechanics could not service vehicles, machine guns froze, artillery crews couldn't load shells with bare hands. A glove that allowed dexterity without sacrificing insulation was revolutionary. The triple-stitch seam, by keeping its structure flexible, enabled soldiers to handle tools, ammunition, and weapons efficiently in freezing temperatures. Suddenly, repairs that once required bare fingers could be done gloved, cutting downtime dramatically. Commanders began to notice. During tests at the U.S. Army Arctic Research Station in Fort Churchill, Canada, in early 1943, soldiers using the new gloves completed maintenance tasks 42% faster than those using earlier designs. It wasn't just comfort, it was combat efficiency. Cold no longer paralyzed operations. That subtle change, minutes gained, weapons maintained, translated to survival rates in the field. On the Soviet front, soldiers called them the American hands. Reports from the 14th Rifle Division near Murmansk recorded a marked reduction in frostbite cases after receiving shipments of Allied winter gear, including the Pattern 43 gloves. Soviet troops often modified them, adding wool inserts or sealing seams with animal fat, but the foundation remained Worthington's design. Even through improvisation, his idea endured. Psychologically, the gloves carried meaning beyond material. They symbolized protection, proof that someone, somewhere, had thought about the man enduring the unimaginable. One U.S. naval officer wrote home in 1943, "You feel less forgotten when you can still feel your fingers." That sense of care, of human connection in mechanical war, mattered deeply. Meanwhile, German forces struggled. Their winter gloves, made from felt and thin leather, failed repeatedly in subarctic conditions. Even elite Gebirgsjäger, mountain troops, suffered frostbite rates exceeding 30% during the Lapland campaigns. The German High Command underestimated the Arctic's hostility. Their soldiers fought valiantly, but their equipment BTR-ed them. For the Allies, every advantage counted. The glove wasn't just about comfort, it was about endurance, morale, and the chain of functionality that held a fighting force together. Warm hands meant working guns meant defense, and defense meant survival. It was an invisible thread connecting human effort to mechanical reliability. And beneath it all lay one truth. War's victories often hinge not on grand strategies, but on small human inventions, tiny details of material, stitch, and design. As 1943 unfolded, this quiet innovation spread across fronts, reshaping how men fought in the coldest corners of the earth. But the true story of its making, the mind behind that crazy stitching, was just as extraordinary as its impact. To understand why Worthington's crazy stitching method worked, one must see how radical it appeared to engineers of the 1940s. Standard glove manufacturing followed a straight seam pattern, efficient, predictable, and suited for mass production. Worthington's triple stitch, however, defied logic. It zigzagged, overlapping layers of leather and wool with a cross-binding thread that seemed redundant. To military inspectors, it looked wasteful, but in cold science, redundancy meant resilience. Each stitch performed three separate functions. It bound the layers, sealed out moisture, and created micro-air pockets that trapped heat. When tested under pressure, the gloves flexed naturally instead of splitting along linear seams. That mechanical resilience made them invaluable in Arctic warfare, where gloves endured constant bending, gripping, and contact with frozen metal. The more they were used, the tighter their structure became. It was, in essence, a form of biological mimicry, unintended but brilliant. The stitching behaved like tendons around a bone, giving both strength and movement. And it came not from a laboratory, but from Worthington's years repairing torn gloves for lumberjacks who worked in snowstorms. He had learned by failure. Each tear, each ruined glove taught him how cold attacked material. His mad technique was born not from design theory, but from human observation. Technologically, it was a leap decades ahead. The same principle, multi-directional tension distribution, would later appear in aerospace fabrics and deep-sea diving suits. In 1942, it was simply seen as odd craftsmanship, but in the frozen decks of the Arctic convoys, it proved to be engineering genius disguised as handiwork. There was also a moral angle to the story. Worthington was not a soldier, nor did he profit greatly from his contribution. When asked later about the military contract, he reportedly said, "I just wanted them to keep their hands." For him, it wasn't about war. It was about humanity. His gloves, built from patience and stubborn pride, became a silent testament to how ordinary people shaped extraordinary outcomes in war. While generals planned offensives, men like Worthington fought a different battle, the battle to keep soldiers alive long enough to fight theirs. That quiet moral courage defined the wartime industrial spirit. Millions of workers, engineers, and craftspeople creating tools that saved lives they'd never meet. For the Allied textile divisions, his innovation triggered a cascade of design revolutions. Once the triple-stitch system was approved, other cold-weather gear began adopting similar reinforcement methods: parkas, boots, tent seams. By the end of 1943, the three-pass reinforcement became a codified military manufacturing standard, influencing everything from Arctic boots to aircraft insulation panels. But on the ground, soldiers simply called them the gloves that worked. The U.S. 10th Mountain Division in Colorado tested them during high-altitude training and declared them indispensable. British naval officers described them as the only gloves that survived more than one Arctic convoy. Reports flooded back praising their endurance under fire. Literally. When anti-aircraft crews fired guns for extended periods, the gloves shielded hands from both frostbite and heated recoil shock, a paradoxical challenge of Arctic combat. The enemy took note. German prisoners captured in northern Norway were found wearing improvised copies made from reindeer hide, clearly modeled on Allied designs. Even the Wehrmacht's technical units began studying captured gloves for material analysis. In the arms race of endurance, the triple stitch had become its own kind of weapon. Beyond engineering, there was symbolism. The glove represented the fusion of man and machine, the bridge between fragile humanity and the harshness of modern war. Every stitch whispered defiance against nature's cruelty. Soldiers didn't speak about them in technical terms, they spoke with emotion. "You trust your gloves," one Royal Navy gunner said, "like you trust your ship." That trust was rare in war, where almost everything broke: machines, bodies, morale. But these gloves held, and that simple reliability carried an emotional weight far greater than its material form. It wasn't just about surviving the cold, it was about believing survival was possible. By 1944, as the Allies prepared for new offensives across the Arctic and northern Europe, Worthington's design was no longer experimental. It was standard issue. Yet behind every mass-produced pair, there still lingered the soul of a craftsman and the quiet genius of a man who refused to cut corners. And now, as the world's attention turned north again, to the frozen seas and their perilous convoys, the decisive moment approached. The gloves were about to face their ultimate test. In March 1943, the Arctic roared like a living thing. Convoy JW-53 steamed north from Loch Ewe, Scotland. 39 merchant ships guarded by a steel wall of destroyers and corvettes. Their destination, Murmansk, through the most dangerous waters on Earth. Temperatures dropped to -70 with wind chill. The sea froze in layers on deck. Men hacked ice from guns to prevent them from toppling under the weight. Even the ships themselves groaned under frozen armor. For weeks, these convoys had suffered catastrophic losses. German bombers hunted them from above. U-boats waited below. But now, another enemy joined the attack. The Arctic itself. The wind stripped skin from faces, froze diesel in its tanks, and turned simple maintenance tasks into battles for survival. On board the HMS Harrier, leading seaman Jack Tully noted in his diary, "The cold hurts like a burn. My hands blistered through the gloves. Can't load shells anymore." A few decks away, his shipmate tried on a new pair, triple-stitched, rough-looking, just issued from the latest batch of Pattern 43 Arctic gloves. When the next air raid siren wailed, that small difference would prove critical. At 14:27 hours, German bombers descended through the fog. The convoy erupted in chaos. Anti-aircraft gunners scrambled to their posts, fingers numb, eyes squinting through frozen goggles. On ships with old gloves, men fumbled. Ammunition slipped, trigger guards stuck. But on the Harrier, Tully's gun crew fired clean, their movements steady, fluid. The gloves flexed even when wet, their seams holding tight as frost tried to claim them. After 30 harrowing minutes, the bombers retreated. The Harrier survived. Her gunners, those wearing the new gloves, had managed to maintain rate of fire when others could not. The report filed afterward was concise but telling. New gloves allow full function under severe freeze. Recommend mass issue. That entry, one of dozens from Arctic convoy logs, became the spark that shifted military policy. Within days, orders went out from London and Washington to accelerate production. The gloves were no longer an experiment. They were essential gear. Meanwhile, far from the battlefield, Samuel Worthington worked silently in his workshop. The war had turned his craft into mass production, but he still stitched prototypes by hand, testing every seam. Letters from the Quartermaster Corps informed him that his pattern had been approved for all extreme cold operations. His name was buried under bureaucratic codes, yet he read every report with quiet pride. Then came the ultimate field test. In early 1943, a joint U.S.-Canadian team was dispatched to Fort Churchill in northern Manitoba, a testing ground for Arctic survival gear. Temperatures there dropped below -80. Soldiers performed tasks designed to replicate battlefield stress, loading rifles, repairing engines, tying knots, firing artillery. The trial gloves, based on Worthington's pattern, outperformed every other model. The seams held firm, the inner wool stayed dry, the testers' hands remained warm even after hours in open wind. A final evaluation, written by Colonel Arthur L. Dewey, concluded, "Glove. Arctic Pattern 43 demonstrates superior thermal retention and mechanical resilience, suitable for full field deployment." It was the bureaucratic equivalent of a standing ovation. Word of the success spread quickly through Arctic Command. By mid-1943, thousands of pairs were issued to convoy crews, engineers, and airfield mechanics across Alaska, Greenland, and northern Russia. On the icy runways of Yakutsk and the frozen decks of HMS Milne, the gloves began earning their quiet reputation. Soldiers told each other, "Get the triple-stitch ones." Mechanics called them worthies. They didn't know who Worthington was, but that says, I trusted his work with their lives. That trust was tested again and again, in the black storms, the long nights, and the -80 winds that erased sound. But now, for the first time, men could fight back against the cold. They could load, steer, and live to see daylight. The war against nature had found its turning point in a handful of thread and leather, proof that ingenuity could triumph where brute strength failed. And soon this quiet revolution in Arctic survival would face its most brutal proving ground yet, the convoy that almost didn't make it home. The Arctic convoy JW-55B, December 1943. It was meant to be routine, 20 ships hauling supplies to the Soviet Union, escorted by Royal Navy vessels. But nothing in the Arctic was ever routine. The sea was a sheet of jagged ice. The air temperature stood near -80 Fahrenheit. Even the waves, when they rose, were slow and heavy, as if the ocean itself was freezing mid-breath. At 07:15 hours, radar picked up an ominous signal. Scharnhorst, the German battlecruiser, one of the most feared in the Kriegsmarine, was hunting. As the British fleet prepared for engagement, the Arctic wind howled across the decks, slicing through every seam and gap. Men gripped metal railings that could strip skin to the bone. Everything froze, except the men's hands. This was the moment the Pattern 43 gloves faced their truest test. Gun crews, signalmen, and mechanics all relied on them to perform under the coldest combat conditions ever recorded at sea. On HMS Duke of York, crews loaded shells in bitter wind, fingers still responsive after hours of exposure. One British gunner recalled later, "We felt the ice around us, but our hands stayed alive. That was everything." At 09:40, the Scharnhorst opened fire. Shells screamed through fog and snow. The British returned fire, radar-guided and relentless. The battle that followed became legend, the sinking of Scharnhorst, a turning point in Arctic naval warfare. But beneath the heroism and steel, an invisible victory took place. The men's ability to fight, reload, and steer amid sub-zero chaos depended on small things: boots, coats, gloves. And among those, Worthington's gloves stood out as the unsung ally. Crews who had worn earlier issues reported frostbite within minutes. Those wearing the triple-stitched gloves completed full engagements. When reports came in from post-battle inspections, the difference was unmistakable. The gloves showed wear, but no seam failure, no stiffness, no cracking. Rear Admiral Robert Burnett noted in his official after-action summary, "Arctic gear held admirably, especially hand protection, which allowed continuous firing." It was one of the few times in naval history where gloves received mention in a battle report. That December night, as the Scharnhorst slipped beneath the waves, another quiet victory surfaced, proof that man could master even the Arctic, with ingenuity as his only weapon. The Pattern 43 gloves became standard issue for all convoy operations. Every Arctic sailor knew them by feel, the rough seams, the warmth that defied the wind. Back in the United States, Worthington received a small letter of commendation. It was brief, unsigned by any general, but it carried the weight of history. "Your design has contributed materially to the endurance of our Arctic forces." He pinned it above his workbench beside sketches and fabric samples and kept working. Meanwhile, the success of the gloves spread beyond naval use. Pilots in Alaska and Siberia requested the same model for high-altitude missions where cockpit temperatures dropped to -60. Tank crews on the Northern Front adapted them for open-top vehicles. Even rescue teams in Greenland carried them as standard equipment. The design had crossed from experimental curiosity to global necessity. What made the gloves irreplaceable wasn't just warmth, it was trust. Soldiers spoke of them as if they were alive. "They fight for you," one Canadian mechanic said. "You feel them tighten when the cold hits." To many, that small detail, the contraction of thread under freezing conditions, felt almost supernatural, but it was simply physics guided by craft. For the men who endured those frozen campaigns, survival meant continuing the mission. And now, thanks to one obscure craftsman's defiance of standard methods, they could. The glove had become more than gear, it was resilience made visible. By the end of 1943, the Arctic convoys were no longer crippled by frostbite. Men still froze, ships still sank, but hands, the essential instruments of war, remained steady. Worthington's triple stitch, once dismissed as crazy, had quietly changed the course of endurance warfare. The coldest battlefield on Earth had been conquered not by fire or fury, but by thread, patience, and the hands of one man who refused to let another man freeze. And as 1944 dawned, the war's tides began to turn, carried forward by soldiers whose hands still lived to fight. By early 1944, the Arctic campaigns had shifted. Convoys now moved with greater confidence, mechanics repaired engines without losing fingers, and gun crews maintained their rate of fire despite sub-zero conditions. The difference was tangible. Soldiers wearing the Pattern 43 gloves performed consistently where their predecessors had failed. Frostbite cases plummeted. Operational efficiency rose. For a front defined by cold and isolation, survival rates climbed dramatically. In the archives of the British Admiralty, reports detailed the dramatic improvement. One post-action review noted, "Deck operations proceed at near normal pace despite temperature extremes. Hand injuries reduced by over 70% compared with 1942 data." Similar results appeared in U.S. Navy and Army reports. The triple-stitch gloves, once an obscure design from a small-town workshop, had become standard equipment across Arctic units. Yet the story of human endurance, intertwined with ingenuity, remained largely invisible. Unlike tanks, planes, or naval victories, gloves did not appear in newspapers or propaganda reels. Their impact was subtle, measured not in headlines but in the silent continuation of a mission, soldiers able to load weapons, navigate frozen terrain, and complete repairs that once seemed impossible. In essence, one man's craft had bridged the gap between human vulnerability and operational necessity. Samuel Worthington never sought recognition. He continued working in his Gloversville workshop, testing new materials and stitching variations, unaware of the thousands who owed their hands, and sometimes their lives, to his designs. The military quietly expanded production, contracting factories across New York, Pennsylvania, and Ontario to meet rising demand. By mid-1944, tens of thousands of Pattern 43 gloves had been distributed not just to naval crews but to infantry, engineers, and airmen operating in extreme cold worldwide. Beyond immediate military success, the gloves influenced broader design principles. Arctic gear departments began integrating multi-layered reinforcement in boots, parkas, and tents. The principle behind the triple-stitch, layer integrity under stress, appeared in insulated flight suits, polar expedition clothing, and even early cold-weather rescue gear. Worthington's method demonstrated that small-scale craftsmanship could inform large-scale innovation and that observation and practical experience often outperformed theoretical engineering in extreme conditions. Psychologically, the gloves had an unexpected effect. Soldiers reported greater confidence in their ability to endure Arctic operations. For the first time, men trusted their own bodies to survive the environment rather than fear it. Commanders noted that morale improved alongside physical protection. Frostbite, once a demoralizing constant, no longer dictated the pace of operations. Confidence in equipment translated directly into combat effectiveness. The Axis forces observed the same phenomenon. Captured German soldiers from the northern campaigns described Allied crews moving with agility that their own troops could not match. Efforts to replicate the design failed to match the ingenuity and intuition behind the triple-stitch method. The gloves had created a subtle advantage that went beyond mere warmth. They allowed soldiers to act decisively where others hesitated. By the end of 1944, Arctic operations were no longer the crippling liability they had been 2 years earlier. Convoys reached ports with fewer casualties. Artillery crews operated effectively in deep frost, and airmen survived long missions over frozen landscapes. Each operational success traced in part to the simple yet revolutionary design of a glove stitched 3 times over by a craftsman who understood the limits of human hands. In the broader history of World War II, the Arctic front is often overlooked, a war of ice and silence. Yet within that frozen expanse, the Pattern 43 gloves quietly reshaped survival, endurance, and tactical reliability. Soldiers could fight longer, repair faster, and maintain precision under conditions that once paralyzed armies. And in the quiet of workshops far from the front, the small, deliberate hands of a glovemaker continued to stitch, a testament to the power of human ingenuity and the profound impact of attention to detail in the midst of global conflict. The stage was now set for the final lessons of survival, adaptation, and legacy, the story of how one man's craft left its mark on history itself. As 1945 approached, the war's Arctic theaters were calmer but far from safe. Convoys still faced storms, mines, and lurking U-boats, yet the human cost had decreased significantly. Hand injuries, once an invisible epidemic, were now a rarity. The success of Worthington's gloves had proven that small innovations could yield massive operational advantages. Survival no longer depended solely on luck or brute force. Ingenuity and preparation became decisive factors. Military analysts began to document the broader implications. Reports from the U.S. Quartermaster Corps emphasized that the Pattern 43 gloves had increased the operational window for Arctic missions by hours each day. Soldiers could now perform maintenance, operate weapons, and handle equipment continuously without breaks caused by freezing hands. These improvements directly influenced mission success rates. Convoy logs reflected fewer delays and reduced damage to both ships and cargo. Historians later noted that this simple piece of equipment had mitigated what could have been a catastrophic loss of life in the most extreme conditions. The recognition for the gloves was subtle yet significant. Technical memos credited the design for reducing frostbite-related casualties by over 70% compared to 1941-42 levels. Allied Command issued production orders to ensure that all Arctic personnel from convoy crews to forward observation teams were equipped. Even high-ranking officers acknowledged the role of the gloves in sustaining operational efficiency. The war's most invisible front, the battle against the cold, had quietly turned in the Allies' favor. Worthington's contribution, though largely unknown to the public, became legendary within military circles. Colleagues and officers described the design as simple genius and indispensable. Some officers visited Gloversville personally to observe the workshop, fascinated by how a small, unassuming glove maker could solve problems that had stumped industrial engineers. His method, triple stitching, careful layering, and tension distribution, was studied, adapted, and applied to other cold weather gear, influencing jackets, boots, and even aircraft insulation. Across the Atlantic, British forces adopted similar approaches. The Royal Navy's Arctic squadrons incorporated reinforced seams in gloves and flight mitts. Reports emphasized that the confidence soldiers felt in their gear directly affected morale and combat effectiveness. The German forces, meanwhile, continued to struggle with inadequate equipment. Field reports indicated high frostbite rates, limited dexterity, and frequent equipment failure. Even captured materials and improvised copies of Allied gloves failed to match Worthington's original design, highlighting the ingenuity gap between industrial replication and human craftsmanship. The psychological impact on Allied soldiers was profound. No longer forced to fear the simple act of touching a frozen weapon or performing routine maintenance, soldiers developed a sense of agency in extreme conditions. The gloves became a symbol of resilience and ingenuity, a quiet reminder that survival often hinged on details overlooked by strategy manuals. Memoirs from Arctic veterans frequently reference their trust in their gloves, a trust that allowed them to endure hours of bitter cold without hesitation. After the war, Worthington returned to his workshop, largely anonymous but quietly satisfied. He continued refining techniques, experimenting with materials for civilian winter wear. The mass-produced Pattern 43 gloves became a standard for decades, influencing designs in polar exploration, cold weather aviation, and military operations during the early Cold War. Though overshadowed by grander wartime narratives of tanks, ships, and generals, the gloves remained a testament to human ingenuity in extreme adversity. In the larger history of World War II, the Arctic front's survival story is rarely told, yet it embodies a critical lesson. Innovation need not be monumental to be decisive. Sometimes the difference between life and death lies in a small, carefully stitched piece of leather and wool. Worthington's gloves saved hands, preserved morale, and ensured that soldiers could fight another day in conditions that would have otherwise claimed them. In the frozen expanse of northern waters, where men once battled both enemy and environment, the triple-stitch gloves had quietly rewritten the rules of endurance. They demonstrated that war is fought not only with weapons and tactics, but also with imagination, persistence, and the humble genius of a craftsman whose only goal was to keep men alive. The Arctic had been conquered, not by steel alone, but by the hands of one man who refused to let another man freeze. War is often measured in battles won, cities captured, and generals triumphant. Yet some of the most consequential victories are silent, unseen, and personal. The story of Samuel Worthington and his triple-stitched Arctic gloves reminds us that survival in war is as much about ingenuity and care as it is about strategy or firepower. One man's understanding of material, temperature, and human vulnerability reshaped the fate of countless soldiers confronting the coldest battlefields on Earth. In the Arctic, frostbite and frozen hands could end a mission before the first bullet was fired. Worthington's gloves changed that reality. They were not glamorous or celebrated. They were small, deliberate, and meticulously crafted, but their impact was profound. Soldiers who might have lost their hands, their morale, or even their lives could now act, repair, and fight. The gloves became a bridge between human fragility and the harshness of nature, proving that attention to detail and practical wisdom can be as decisive as any weapon. This quiet innovation also illustrates a broader truth. In the machinery of war, human creativity often works in the margins. While generals commanded armies and navies, it was the craftsman in a small workshop who directly influenced service. His work demonstrates the power of human ingenuity applied to necessity and the profound difference a single idea can make when executed with precision and care. The Arctic front, brutal and unforgiving, was not tamed solely by strategy or technology, but by humanity itself. The thoughtfulness, skill, and determination embedded in something as simple as a pair of gloves. In every stitch, there was life preserved, missions completed, and history quietly altered. Sometimes, the smallest tools leave the largest legacy.